Is Iran a threat to Israel and the West? Should the United States partner with Israel to defeat the nuclear threat coming out of Iran? And what would the aftermath look like? All of that I discuss right now with David M. Weinberg, who is a senior fellow at MISCAV, the Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy, as well as IDSF. Listen to what we spoke about. David Weinberg, it's always a great pleasure to chat with you. You always have so much to share, much insight, and you recently published an article in Israel Hayom. You're a prolific writer. I'm going to share this link and also a link to your site so our viewers can follow your writings. And you really outlined the problems with Iran and the needs for a decisive action against them. And I think it would be very helpful if we can kind of go back to the basics and you can outline for us what is the threat for Iran and why there must be a U.S.-Israel action against Iran.
I thank you, Moshe. It's a pleasure to be back here with you and Habitchonistim, friends and followers. I find that foreign leaders and officials, even those who specialize in the Middle East, truly are not aware of the scope of Iranian muckraking and troublemaking in the region. Generally, they know that there's bad actors out there from Al-Qaeda to ISIS and Hezbollah, but they don't have a comprehensive picture of Iranian belligerence and ambition. Worse still, they often wrongly assume that the JCPOA, President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, is still in place. And this shunts concerns about Iran to the back burner. Nor do they know that this October 25, Obama's so-called snapback mechanism for sanctions on Iran expires, giving Iran, under the terms of the accord, a legitimate path to a nuclear bomb. Now, some North American and European leaders that I meet when they visit Israel prefer to pretend that Israel is exaggerating the menace of Iran. And therefore, instead of being willing to invest time and effort and thought in confronting Iran's tectonic threat to the Middle East and to global stability, they focus on a range of secondary issues. Europeans in particular love to talk about humanitarian relief for Palestinians in Gaza and settlements in Judea and Samaria. And now they're into stabilization of the new regime in Syria. And if we're lucky, in pursuit of a bit of balance in their foreign policies, they might even feign some interest in the fate of Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. Now, these are all important issues, but they're a sideshow to the urgency of halting Iran's aggressive march across the Middle East. So let's do what you asked me to do, Moshe, which is summarize the treacherous Iranian record for those who have not been paying sufficient attention, or again, for those who allege that Israel is exaggerating the Iranian threat. First of all, Iran has sought to carve out a corridor of control, what we might call a Shiite land bridge, stretching from the Arabian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and this includes major parts of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, under the control of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and its Quds Force, various Shiite militias, and of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this corridor has given Iran a broad strategic base for aggression across the region. And in fact, up until now, it has deterred Israel from operating against Iran. And that was because Iran equipped Hezbollah with at least 150,000 missiles and rockets aimed at Israel. And of course, it supplied Hamas with the arms and the rockets that have fueled 4 significant confrontations with Israel over the past decade. Now, fortunately, as you all know, over the past year, Israel has operated to significantly defang and decapitate Hezbollah. And the subsequent fall of the Assad regime in Syria to Sunni forces under the leadership of this new guy, al-Jolani, has weakened Iran's Shiite arc across the region as well. And of course, the IDF has acted to destroy Hamas military capabilities and end its rule of Gaza, a campaign that is still underway. So that's number one. Number two, Iran is fomenting subversion in Mideast countries that are Western allies, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. And it's particularly focused on destabilizing the Hashemite regime in Jordan, because then it would gain access to Israel's longest border, Israel's border with Jordan, and from there be able to attempt to penetrate Israel's heartland. Number three, we know that the mullahs in Iran are behind the terrorist infrastructure that is fueling violence against Israel and radical Islamic groups in Judea and Samaria. That's an infrastructure currently being exposed and destroyed by the IDF, but that's long, hard work. The Iranians have invested tons of weaponry and cash in this. Fifth, Iran has sponsored terrorism and continues to sponsor terrorism against Western, Israeli, and Jewish targets around the world, from Buenos Aires to Burgas. It maintains an active terrorist network of proxies, agents, and sleeper cells worldwide. And fifth, and I'll stop here before we continue the conversation, Iran is rapidly approaching full nuclear military status, with Iranian enrichment and bomb assembly facilities buried in underground bunkers. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, Iran has enriched uranium to almost bomb-ready levels, with its stock of refined uranium growing by almost 100 kilos in the past quarter alone, approaching something like 300 kilos of refined uranium. By international standards, that's sufficient for about 6 nuclear weapons. And the final sprint towards these weapons is achievable within months. Now, you would say Israel can rely on the pledge of the past 6 U.S. presidents, all of them. They all pledged that Iran would never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. But then Obama cut a rotten soft deal with Iran that legitimized the nuclear program and afforded Iran billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, in sanctions relief and cash aid. And President Biden continued in this path. There was even a statement about a year and a half ago by Biden's chief of staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, which seemed to suggest that America was dialing back its commitment to stopping Iran. Milley said something like that the U.S. remains committed only to ensuring that Iran would not have a fielded nuclear weapon. And this suggested to some, to me as well, that the Biden administration was prepared to tolerate a developed nuclear weapon in Iran's hands as long as the weapons were not fielded, in other words, deployed. And therefore, when you couple this with Iran's formidable long-range missile arsenal, which it has fired twice over the past year into Israel, along with its attack drone fleet, you have to be concerned about the Iranian nuclear military abilities. And I think that a decisive military strike on Iran's nuclear bomb facilities and missile bases is essential. It is the linchpin of a necessary regional reset, the fulcrum for ameliorating most flashpoints in the region, and it's not going to go away by another round of U.S. negotiations with Iran, even under the more aggressive Trump administration.
David, let me ask you a question. In terms of the hierarchy of threats against the U.S. that the U.S. has to consider, Where do you think Iran falls? And more specifically, North Korea is a constant concern for the U.S., and the U.S. has taken this stance of deterrence with North Korea, and as of yet has not had a major threat, a nuclear weapon coming out of North Korea. Is that a model, perhaps, that the U.S. uses for Iran, that it's not its greatest threat right now, and deterrence has worked with North Korea, it can work with Iran as well?
Your question is an excellent question because it pertains to American strategic objectives and specifically the Trump administration's grand strategic objectives. Like Biden, Trump has defined China as the great challenge to America in every way for the next century, economically and strategically. And pushing back against China remains a central preoccupation of the Trump administration. We see that in all his recent moves. In that grand strategic game, peeling Russia away from its current alliance with Iran and China is a strategic priority. And to a certain extent, that's why we see Trump being so generous in his negotiations with Russia over Ukraine, because he's seeking to reach understandings with Putin of Russia at Ukraine's expense. That would draw Russia away from the alliance with Iran and China. There is therefore strategic logic behind Trump's current talks with Russia over Ukraine, as much as you and I may not like the fact that he essentially is pinning blame for the Russian-Ukraine conflict on the victim, which is the Ukraine. Iran is a strategic threat to global stability, not just to Israel, certainly to all the regional actors that I mentioned beforehand, and it's a strategic challenge to the United States. It's not one that the United States can't handle. Both militarily and diplomatically, the United States can put Iran back in its corner with decisive diplomatic and military force if it's willing to go there. And Trump has said that he prefers a diplomatic solution, and we may even see talks sometime over the next month beginning in, let's say, Dubai or Abu Dhabi between the Americans and the Iranians. Israel's currently asking Washington to put a cap, a timeline cap on such talks if they develop. Not to let the Iranians drag this out, which is what they're famous for doing. They'd love to have talks that run from now well into the next winter, which takes them past the October snapback expiry date. That can't be allowed to happen. If there's going to be a diplomatic effort, some negotiation with the Iranians, it has to be capped, and America has to be willing to draw conclusions when and if, and I think it's a question of when, such talks fail.
In your recent article, you write that Iran sells roughly $2 billion a month of oil to China against international sanctions. So, if the U.S. involvement here is not focused on Iran, but to weaken China and Russia, could the argument be made that the U.S. would be more interested in going after Iranian oil fields or distribution methods rather than their nuclear program?
I don't think that's the central U.S. interest here. In general, oil has become far less dominant in international currency ever since natural gas came online and America began fracking. The U.S. economy is certainly not dependent on Middle East and not on Iranian oil anymore. But your point is important. In violation of all international sanction regimes, Iran does sell billions of dollars a month of oil to Iran. Iran also makes a lot of money from drug production and distribution across the Middle East and Europe, and through money laundering cryptocurrency schemes. This was revealed 2 years ago by the Israeli Defense and Foreign Affairs Ministries. Unfortunately, it wasn't picked up widely in the international media. Unfortunately, no surprise there. The Trump administration has sought to tighten sanctions on Iran to interdict its oil shipments. A next stage in tightening the screws Iran would be, a naval blockade on oil tankers coming out of the Arabian Gulf going to Iran. But of course, that's the beginning of acts of warfare, and Trump hasn't moved there yet. But that's the type of thing we could expect to see if there is no movement on the Iranian front. I don't believe that Iran's going to enter into a serious negotiation with Washington. Iran is never going to be willing to give up its nuclear and military, its missile programs, its nuclear program, its weaponization, its uranium enrichment facilities, lock, stock, and barrel. U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said 2 weeks ago that Iran must hand over and give up all elements of its nuclear and missile programs. That's never going to happen. If they get into a conversation about capping these programs, that's very dangerous. That's not acceptable to Israel. I hope we don't go there.
And do you think the Iranian nuclear program is an imminent threat right now? Meaning, Israel has been talking about the threat from Iran for decades and decades. What has changed right now that would really cause direct action against the Iranian regime?
Well, one central thing is what we talked about earlier, is the weakening of the Shiite land bridge, or the Iranian arc across the region, by decapitating Hezbollah and taking out Iran's air defenses, which Israel did several months ago. Iran is more vulnerable than ever. And a vulnerable Iran may think that a rush to full nuclear military capacity is its insurance policy. And remember, Iran constantly threatens Israel with war and eventual destruction. Ayatollah Khamenei is unmistakably clear. He regularly refers to Israel as a cancerous tumor in the Middle East that has to be removed. He speaks of the complete liberation of Palestine, meaning the destruction of Israel through holy jihad. The Iranians provided hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas. Those of you who haven't seen should take a look at the major research report, the expose that Nadav Shragai published in Israel Hayom. It was about 2 weeks ago in Hebrew and a week ago in English, based on documents that were captured in Gaza. The extent of Iranian backing for Hamas was far deeper and far more significant than that we had realized or people had known beforehand. And therefore, given Israel's strikes on the Shiite arc, given Israel's weakening of Iran's own defenses, given Trump's threats, Iran surely feels exposed, and it's close enough to firm nuclear capacity, what's called completing the nuclear fuel cycle. And it's developed enough in its weaponization efforts, and it's got this massive ballistic missile capability that they could not only reach full nuclear military status, but be tempted to use such a weapon against Israel. And therefore, this is urgent.
Now, I know you're not a prophet. I don't think you claim to be a prophet, but assuming that Israel with the U.S. were to have a decisive strike on the Iranian nuclear program, what do you think the fallout from that would be? Would it turn into a broader conflict with China and Russia? Would the proxies of Iran have the sense of they have nothing to lose and they would increase their attacks? What do you think the major concerns would be?
Okay, the main argument um, made by American thinkers and analysts who are opposed to any strike on Iran um, is that this would draw America into a broader regional war and would endanger American troops and interests across the region. Um, the people who want to scare America away from acting against Iran say, well, the Iranians will hit U.S. troops in Iraq, they'll hit Saudi oil facilities. Um, they, of course, will strike out at Israel, and Iran will unleash its terrorist sleeper cells around the world, which I mentioned, cells that I mentioned earlier. I think that's an exaggerated threat. Uh, yes, a full scale confrontation with Iran that acts take out Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile facilities and perhaps even seeks to decapitate um, Iranian leadership would not necessarily go down quietly, but I think the threat of widespread or even global escalation is overrated. You have to remember every single time the U.S. or Israel have thought of operating against their enemies in recent years, there's these type of scaremongering threats. Remember what they said about the move of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, how it would cause the region to go on fire, and U.S. embassies would be attacked in 5 dozen countries around the world. That never happened. And if Israel strikes Iranian air defense and missile facilities, that would bring about a full-scale conflict with Israel and Iran. That hasn't happened yet either. And it's the same with the current U.S. strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. Biden administration was constantly in fear of escalation. Escalation was the one word you heard most. Oh my God, no escalation, no escalation. We don't want escalation. Europe and the Biden administration threw that word out 50 times a day. Avoid anything and everything that could lead to escalation. And of course, they didn't want Israel to deepen its drive into Gaza at every stage of the way as well, fearing escalation. Um, it's time that we stop fearing escalation. Escalation in this case against Iran, I'll argue, is the right policy. It will help reset the region. It will prevent greater war. It will ameliorate most flashpoints in the region. It will satisfy and reassure American allies in the Arab world and in Israel. And it will help, as I said, advance Trump's strategic goals in reasserting American primacy in international affairs and help him push back against China.
The Israeli airstrike against the Iraqi nuclear reactor back in 81, that was a little bit before my time. Do you recall what the reaction was thereafter in Israel, the US? Was it doom and gloom immediately after that airstrike or life as usual?
So I was here in Israel as a yeshiva student in 1981. I remember the grand sense of relief and even jubilation that I and my friends and all Israelis felt at the time. There also was a stinging resentment at the condemnation that was hurled at Israel from around the world, what I think all Israelis viewed as hypocritical condemnation. Israel was doing the world a favor, not just itself, by taking out the Iraqi nuclear reactor in Osirak. And the U.S. administration at the time penalized Israel for striking the reactor. There was a holdup in weapons delivery, including fighter jets, condemnation at the United Nations, which was supported by the United States. And Israelis were very resentful of that. Only many, many, many years later did later American senior officials and administrations admit that Israel had done a good thing, and had Israel not taken out that reactor, the threat to American interests in the region would only have grown. But, in relative terms, that was an easy target. It was one target in one place. And Israel had, sufficient intelligence in real time for Prime Minister Begin at the time to make the decision to take out the one sole single Iraqi nuclear reactor. The Iranian nuclear program, of course, is much larger, much more spread out. As I said earlier, buried deep underground in some places, in near impenetrable underground facilities that can probably be destroyed only by certain very heavy ordnance bombs that the U.S. has, and only the U.S. has, or only the U.S. has the delivery mechanisms for weapons that large. So it's a much more complicated thing. And of course, Iran is a much more powerful and stable country. Iran can rebuild even after such a strike, unless the strike is so significant that it also brings about internal changes in Iran. And there is, we didn't discuss this, but there is a lot to talk about what would the aftermath of such an attack be inside Iran. Would this be a spur to regime change in Iran that so many have talked about and hoped for a long time? That's a entire different conversation.
That was my conversation with David Weinberg, a senior fellow at the Miscavige Institute, as well as the IDSF Research Department. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.